So you've taken measurements of your room, but now what? What in the world should your measurements look like? Which graph should you use? And how can you take what your measurements are showing you and turn that into an action plan for improving the sound in your studio? I'm Graham with Music City Acoustics, and in part 2 of our series on REW, we're going to answer all of those questions and help you make sense of your acoustic measurements. If you haven't already seen part 1, click the link right here and then come back and watch this video. It'll make a whole lot more sense. So let's jump right in. In order to actually be able to analyze things well, we need a complete measurement set. So we're going to need a measurement of your left speaker by itself, your right speaker by itself, and then the left and the right speaker together. And if you're using a sub, you're also going to want the sub by itself, as well as the left and sub together, the right and sub together, and then the left, right, and sub all together. As you'll see when we start going through measurements, we don't always need that complete set of measurements, but if you're sending measurements off to us or somebody else to analyze, or you want a better understanding of what's going on in your room, it is important to take all 7 of those measurements so you can get a full picture and understanding what's happening. And then a couple of quick notes and tips on taking measurements. You want your measurement microphone to be at ear height when you're seated in the listening position, and it should be equidistant from your left and your right speakers so to be perfectly centered in your room. So in part 1, you may have noticed that I said you need tape, but I didn't explain why. And it's just so that you can mark the location of your speaker stands and your microphone stand so you can put things back once you've determined where the best location for those is in your room. It's incredibly important to use consistent settings when you're analyzing different measurements. So let me show you really quickly what can happen to a measurement if you zoom in and then zoom out. Let's use this measurement here as an example. I've got my normal view limit set, and if I start to zoom out on this measurement, you're going to see just how flat we can make what is obviously a very wavy and inconsistent looking graph look nearly ruler flat. So as you can see, the same measurement now was incredibly smoothed out, and it's not going to really reveal any information to us about what's happening in this room. That's why it's incredibly important to standardize your view settings so you're always looking at measurements under the same parameters. I have all of the view limits and standards that I use for analyzing measurements listed out below in the description, so check those out so you can use them for your measurements. So quick interruption. I've been editing this video and it is dense and it's long, but it's got a ton of awesome info in it, I promise. So we're breaking this video up into 2 parts. Part 1 is going to be defining the measurements and showing you how the graphs actually work and are laid out. And then part 2, we're going to break down different example measurements that we've prepared and show you how to analyze your measurements and really figure out what's going on in your room. Down below, there are timestamps and chapters for each section of the video so you can jump around and go back and review things later on. So grab a pen and pencil, coffee, and some snacks maybe, and let's jump right in. Here I have our SPL and phase graph pulled up. And what this is currently showing us is the frequency response in our room here. And as you can probably tell, this thing is a complete mess right now. So we need to smooth this out so we can actually start to see what's going on in this room. To do that, I'm going to head up to the menu bar in the top left here, and this will show us the different smoothing options that we have. Smoothing allows us to change what we're looking at, kind of reduce the resolution so that we can get a better picture of what's actually happening. The measurement microphones that we use are much more sensitive than our ears are. And so while the measurement mic can perceive all these changes and variations that are happening in the room, we can't. So the psychoacoustic smoothing option here, this is the best depiction of how we would actually hear the room and perceive what it sounds like. It's not great if you're trying to hone in on specific problems and really figure out what you need to fix, but it is a very useful way of viewing measurements if you're trying to figure out, how you should EQ your monitors or what the overall tonal balance of your room is. If I'm trying to hone in on just a low frequency problem, I'll change my view settings here and then go to 1/48th or 1/24th. This still gives us a lot of clarity and definition so we can get a really good sense of what's going on in the graph here, but also allows us to, have a better overall picture of what's happening so we don't see quite so many of those crazy squiggly lines going on. If we're trying to get a broader sense of what's happening in the room, I'll typically use 1/12th to 1/3 depending on what I'm looking at. 1/3 is the smoothing that is used for pretty much every technical standard and technical measurement. So if you see measurements of a speaker or a microphone, those typically have 1/3 smoothing applied to them. And if you're looking at technical standards for what a critical listening room should sound like, those are also generally written with 1/3 smoothing applied. So if you're reading through anything that says your frequency response should be plus or minus 2 dB to meet the EBU standards, that's plus or minus 2 dB with 1/3 smoothing applied. Most of the best home studios tend to fall a little bit closer to plus or minus 5 dB with 1/3 smoothing, and as you'll see when we start going through the example measurements, that's actually quite achievable. So I have 1/12 smoothing applied to our graph here. But even with this, it's quite hard to really tell anything that's happening in the low end. So down in the bottom right here, you have this 20 to 20,000 hertz view setting, and then also a 20 to 300 hertz. If I click on that, I can quickly change on the screen what I'm looking at. Our measurement is still falling off the ends of our graph here. I have my normal view settings pulled up, but if I zoom out just a little bit, now we can get a better picture of what's actually happening because we can see the top and the bottom of this graph. And now we can start to see how much variation we have. If I hit Control and right click, REW will tell me what the overall variation in this room's response is. And so we can see a variation of 32 dB or 33 dB. That's plus or minus 16, 16 and a half. So this room as is has a huge variation in its frequency response. For an untreated room or a room with minimal treatment, this is completely normal. These things are ugly and they're going to be really wavy. So don't get discouraged when you start looking at your measurements. Making big changes can be a challenge, but every little bit helps. The SPL or frequency response graph is a great tool for comparing one measurement to another or analyzing the overall tonal balance of a room. By default, this is the first graph that REW shows us, but it's actually probably the least helpful or the least insightful in terms of understanding what's happening in your room. So let's jump into some of the other measurements that we have available to us, and we'll take a closer look at what's actually going on in the room. In addition to our frequency response, we can also view our phase here. This will be super helpful if you're trying to integrate a sub along with your speakers. We're going to take a closer look at this a little bit later on, so I won't touch on it too much now. Next up, we have our impulse response or energy time curve measurements here. This lets us see how sound is moving throughout the room. It'll show us over time the sound arriving directly at the microphone and then all the reflected sound afterwards and how that's impacting the overall energy in the room. So this is the impulse response window. And then up top, we also have this filtered impulse response. I prefer using the filtered impulse response because it actually allows you to filter this by octave band. So if you want to hone in on what's happening in a specific frequency range, you can do that by selecting a different octave band here in the top right. For now, we're going to take a look at the unfiltered measurement. So I'm going to apply my normal view limits here, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in this room. So on the x-axis, we have time plotted out. You'll see in milliseconds. I like to view this graph either from 0 to 50 milliseconds or 0 to 30 milliseconds. In an untreated room, we're going to have more reflections occurring later on, so 50 milliseconds is more appropriate right now. Our y-axis is showing us a percentage, and this is a percentage of how much sound is occurring after the initial sound source. So if I zoom out, we'll start to see our initial peak here is at 100%. So this is the initial sound source, and then everything after this is the decay in the room. These are all big reflections off of a boundary, so either the walls or the floor, the ceiling, or a desk. And then we can start to see and analyze over time when those are occurring. And if we know when in time those occur, we can actually figure out which boundary they're coming off of and then determine where we need to put treatment or what we might need to move to smooth out some of those reflections. So you might have noticed this line that's coming down here on our graph. That's the Schroeder integral, and it's depicting the overall decay shape of the room. What we'd like to see here is to have a very smooth decay without any of these sharp drops or flat lines moving across. Obviously, in this case, with an untreated room, we've got a pretty uneven response here. But as we get into more and more treated rooms, you want to see that really smooth out and have a nice even decay. It will also come way down. So my normal view parameters for this graph actually only go up to 35%, but you'll see here, we completely cut that off if I view it that way. So in order to view this untreated room, you really got to zoom out so we can get a better sense of the overall decay of the room. RT60, or reverb time, is something you're probably actually familiar with. It is the amount of time it takes sound to decay by 60 dB. Now in studios, we don't typically use RT60 because it's very hard to have that long of a decay time and we don't have a truly diffuse sound field. So what you'll see in here is actually T20 or T30 and a couple of different options here. If I'm analyzing a studio, I will pretty much always use T20 as the timing reference here. And that's just how long it takes the sound to decay by 20 dB instead of 60. In the RT60 window, our view settings or limits will change quite a bit depending on whether or not we're looking at a treated room or an untreated room. As you'll see here, I have this set to 1.5 seconds. But if this room were treated and for a normal control room or a mixed room, we want that reverb time to be much closer to 200 milliseconds or between 150 or maybe 250 milliseconds. So that's all the way down here. But obviously in an untreated room, we've got this huge reverb time of over 1 second. So your limits will just kind of change depending on what it is that you're looking at. Overall, what we want to see in this graph is a very nice even decay time. We don't want any big changes from one band to another. As we get into treated rooms, this whole thing will drop way down to here. What typically happens in well-treated rooms, you have a nice even response from the top of the graph down to 100 hertz or so, and then you'll start to see the low frequency decay time slightly rise. And that's completely normal. We don't want to have a massive rise there, so you don't want to go from 200 milliseconds to 700 or 500. But if it goes up to 300 milliseconds or so, 400, if the room doesn't have a lot of bass trapping, that's going to be pretty normal. So don't be alarmed if you start to see a rise in the decay time of your lower frequencies. That brings us to my two favorite measurements, the waterfall plot and the spectrogram. And these both show the same thing with just slightly different views. They're going to show us the overall frequency response of the room, and you'll see that here on the waterfall plot on the top. And they also show the decay of the room across the frequency spectrum. So on the waterfall plot, you'll see on the right-hand side here, we have time mapped out. And so as this graph is moving towards us or towards the front of the screen, we can actually see the decay of the room. If I change our view settings here to just the low frequencies, we'll get a better idea what that looks like. So we can see on the graph here, we have certain frequencies that are taking longer to decay than other. These peaks that are coming towards us here at like 214 or over here at like 240, those are the frequencies in this graph that are taking the longest to decay. So if we hop on over to the spectrogram graph, we have the same information just shown to us in a different way. So here on the left side of the graph, we have time. And then on the bottom right, or moving across to the right on the x-axis, we have frequency. And then the SPL level of our measurement is actually shown using the colors here. So the red color here is the loudest, highest SPL level, and then this dark blue is going to be the quietest or softest SPL level in the measurement. And then we can very clearly see here, which frequencies are taking longer to decay. So if I change our view settings here to just the 20 to 300 hertz frequency range, we can get a really detailed view of what's happening. We can start to see which frequencies are lasting longer and taking longer to decay, and then which frequencies are maybe missing some information or where we have a null in our response. This allows us to get a really complete picture of what's happening in the room. You can see both the frequency response and the decay at each individual frequency, so we can put together a plan on how to treat the room, or we can see if the treatments that we have in the room are being effective. So like I said, the waterfall and spectrogram graphs show the same information, just in slightly different ways. For more detailed analysis of which frequencies are decaying too long in the room, I like to use the spectrogram graph because you can really hone in on the detailed information here from one frequency to another. For overall analysis and bigger picture views of what's happening in a room, the waterfall plot is great. You might have noticed there's a few measurements and graphs that we didn't touch on. Things like group delay and minimum phase, some of the more advanced sides of REW. Then there's also measurements like clarity, which we didn't touch on. And that's not something that's used a whole lot in studios, but is used a lot in venues, churches, offices. If that's something that you want to see, let us know down in the comments below and we can make a part 3 to this series. Here I have two measurements pulled up from my office. I have a before and then an after measurement. The after measurement was taken with our home studio room kit installed, and the before measurement was taken with nothing in this room. We're going to go through all of the different measurements and see how things are changing with and without that treatment. There's a couple of main points I want to go over. One, it's super important to use the right treatment for what you're trying to accomplish. If you want really, really solid, tight, low end, you need big bass traps, and you need those bass traps to be installed with air gaps behind them so that they can work well. The second point is that the SPL graph, like I mentioned earlier, does not tell the whole picture. So as you'll see when we're going through these different graphs, the SPL measurement doesn't change a whole lot. We have a pretty consistent frequency response between these two measurements, but every other measurement is going to show a very different picture. So it's important to use all those when you're analyzing your measurements so that you really understand what's going on in your room. So I have the frequency response overlay pulled up here, and our before measurement is marked out in red, and the after measurement is marked out in this teal color. And you can see we don't have a whole lot of change happening here between the before and after. What we do see is a change up here in the higher frequencies and then in our mid frequencies as well. We see a lot more variation in the treated room than we actually do in the untreated room. This is a result of the clarity in the room improving. And that might seem a little confusing as it clearly looks like the graph isn't as smooth. But what's actually happening in that red measurement or the before measurement is that all those reflections are smearing out the frequency response of the room. We have a ton of reflected sound, so there's no real definition or clarity to the sound in the space. And that can actually result in a flatter measurement, but it doesn't give you any detail or definition, and it doesn't really let you hear the sound of your speakers because you're hearing the reflected sound in the room. That's not to say that this is what you want your frequency response graph to look like. There's definitely more treatment that could be applied to this space to make a big improvement to the way this room sounds. This room had our home studio kit installed in it, and that's very much so meant to be a starting point when you're treating your room. It doesn't have a ton of panels, and it doesn't have any big bass traps, so it doesn't have anything capable of really working below 100 Hertz or so, and that's why we don't see any real change in the low frequency response of this room. As you'll notice if we look at the graph here, our low frequency response below 100 Hertz has almost no change to it. But in order to really affect change at that frequency range, you need big bass traps. You need them to be at least 6 inches deep, and then to really make them effective in that range, they have to have at least 6 inches of air behind them. That really requires a total of a 12-inch deep bass trap, and in this room we mostly had high, mid, and broadband panels. That's why using the right treatment for what you're trying to accomplish is so important, because there's no way that we can change the low-end response of a room if we're not using the right treatment. So let's take a look at some of our other graphs and see if the treatment actually is making a difference in the room. Now with our ATC measurement pulled up, we can see a huge difference in these two measurements, which is a pretty striking comparison to that SPL measurement we were just looking at. Now we can see our red measurement or our before measurement has a ton of reflected sound as you would expect to see. So the acoustic treatment in this room actually is doing quite a lot, and we can see a big drop in reflected energy, which will translate into a much greater level of clarity and detail in the room and better stereo imaging. All of these red spikes here are an increase in reflected energy and a much longer decay time into the room. So with that in mind, let's take a look at our RT60 measurement and see what that's telling us. So the first thing I notice is that I only have one measurement visible on this graph. It looks like both are checked off. So we need to adjust our view limits here so that we can actually see the before measurement. So let me change this to 1.5 seconds. And now we can actually see it on our graph. This is a pretty wild change here. We've got the treated room down here living around 250 milliseconds or so with a sizable rise in the low end as we would expect to see because we haven't actually treated the low end at all. And then we have our untreated room all the way up here at around 1 second. So the treatment that we do have in the room is very effective from 70 Hertz all the way up to 10,000 Hertz. It's just not doing a whole lot below that like we talked about while looking at the SPL measurement. Now I have the spectrogram window pulled up, so let's see what's going on here. So on first glance, what I notice is a pretty wide variation in the colors. So we've got some hotspots down here in our low and low mids, and then a pretty big variation up here in our highs and our mid frequencies. And then along with that, we've got obviously a very long decay time shown here with all these blue spikes trending upwards of 600 milliseconds or so. Now let's jump to the after measurement, and we get a pretty striking contrast here. We have a much more even dispersion of our red color, which is indicating a more even frequency response. And then on top of that, we obviously have the much improved decay time in the room, which we saw in our RT60 measurement, as well as the ETC graphs. All of these things are showing us that there was a massive change to this room, despite the fact that it's not really shown on the frequency response or the SPL graph. And that's why it's so important that we use all of the different measurements available to us in REW so that we can get a complete picture of what's happening and really understand how to improve your room. So let's talk about subs and how you can tell if your speakers and your sub are working well together. So I've got a measurement set prepared here. I'm going to pull up our overlay so we can start to compare things. Here's the frequency response of just our speaker. And then let me add in just the sub. So we can see here, our sub is starting to fill in some of this low frequency information that the speaker isn't putting out. And we very clearly have a crossover occurring right around 56 Hertz here, and then pretty similar responses up above that. What we want to see if we take a measurement of the sub and the speaker together is that those two sources are working well together, so that they're adding up to a more even response that has an extended low frequency. If I add in our sub and speaker measurement here, now we can see we have an extended low frequency response and we haven't lost anything. So our crossover point is still having a positive effect here. We've gained amplitude. The null that we had, while we didn't fill it, we didn't create any new problems. So those two sources are working really well together. Now I'm going to add in another measurement. This again is our speaker and sub, but this time I flipped the phase switch on the sub 180 degrees. So we've got a pretty striking contrast here. Now we have a huge null occurring at 56 Hz, right where we saw that crossover point was, and the low frequency extension that we had gained has been diminished quite a bit. Higher up, we are seeing some differences as well, but that sub was low passed at 50 Hz. So the main changes that we were really seeing here, and the huge problem, is this massive null that we created. And this is why having your phase and your speaker time aligned and correctly phase aligned is so important, because we need them to work together so they're adding to one another instead of subtracting or fighting each other. Another way that we can analyze this and ensure that our speaker and our sub are working well together is with the phase graph. So this is shown with our frequency on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis on the left here, we actually have it shown in degrees. So the phase measurement is going to look pretty different from what we're used to. Let me hide most of these, and then we'll look at just the speaker and the sub. Phase is shown in degrees, so if you flip the phase switch on something, it's going to flip 180 degrees out of phase, so it's completely reversed. So if we have something that's at 0 degrees, and then we have something that's at 180 degrees, those two sound sources will cancel out or fight each other. The same thing if you have it at minus 180 or 0. If we look at our measurement here, we'll see that as we get higher in frequency, our graph is moving downwards, and that's completely normal. What the dotted lines indicate here is that as our measurement is moving downward, REW has wrapped it, so they just move it straight up 360 degrees. So we haven't had any rotation or change to this measurement yet, but in order to keep it on the graph so that it doesn't continually trend downward, they've wrapped it so that we can still see it and analyze it. You can turn that off up here. So now you can see that this continues downward. And if I scroll over, it'll start to take a sharp dip. And obviously we can't keep all of this on the screen. So we can wrap the phase so that it's easier for us to analyze things and see the complete picture in one window. I'm going to pull up our two sub measurements, our regular sub and then our sub with the phase flipped. So let's take a look and see where these fall on our graph. So we've got minus 28 or so here, and if I move upwards, we're going to be at minus 149 or so. So these are basically 180 degrees out of phase with one another. So if these two sources played at the same time, they would be completely canceling each other out. Anytime you're looking at a phase measurement and we have two sources that are completely out of phase with one another, we know we're going to have a problem. Now let's take a look and see what just the speaker looks like. And then we'll see what happens when we add in the speaker and the sub. Now we can see when we add in our speaker, we're not creating any major phase changes to the response, which is exactly what we want. Those two things are summing really nicely together and they're not fighting each other. So now I want to add in the measurement of our speaker and the phase flipped sub. If we take a look at this, we can start to see a huge phase shift occurring. This is an indication that those two sources are not aligned well and that we have a problem. So the ways that you could go about fixing this would be to either move the sub to a new position in the room or to flip that phase switch in this case. If they're not perfectly 180 degrees out of phase, moving the sub to a new position or moving your speaker to a new position is going to be the best way to get those better aligned. Let's take a look at a couple of different measurements here that really clearly show SBIR, or speaker boundary interference response. These reflections are off of boundaries, either like your desk or your wall or your ceiling, and they can cause really big dips or peaks in your frequency response. I've got a couple of measurements here that I took in our demo room. Our first measurement had panels on all 4 of the walls, and then the second measurement, I took those panels off of the front wall so we could see what would change when we removed those panels. Our red response here has panels on all 4 walls, and then our green response with this big dip in it doesn't have panels on the front wall. So as we can see, we got this big change around 240 Hertz in our frequency response. And then we also had a bit of an increase in the low end at 68 Hertz, or room mode, and another increase and variation here a little bit higher up in the 400 range. So right off the bat from the frequency response, we can see things are getting worse without those panels on the front wall behind the speaker. To get a better sense of what was happening in the room, let's take a look at our energy time curve and see if we can find those reflections that are causing the change in our frequency response. Again, we have the red measurement, which did have panels on the front wall, and our green measurement, which did not have panels on the front wall. And right off the bat here, we can start to see some really big variations between these two measurements. Our green measurement has more reflected sound in this very early range, around 3 to 6 milliseconds, and then again here at 8 milliseconds. And then as we move later on in time, we can start to see some really big peaks in energy here. So we've got these two, and then later on as well, around 21, 22, and 23 milliseconds, we have these big spikes, and again a little bit later. And these are all contributing to those changes that we saw in the frequency response. This allows us to figure out exactly where this reflected sound is coming from. Sound travels just about 1 foot for every millisecond. So we can figure out that if this reflection here occurred 11 milliseconds after our initial sound source, that this sound or this energy had to travel an additional 11 feet. We can then map out in our room, either on a piece of paper or take a string and figure out, which surfaces or which boundaries it could have bounced off of that would fit that 11 millisecond range. Then we can put a panel there to test and see if that's the area of the room that we actually need treatment in. With a little testing and use of the energy time curve or your impulse response measurements, you can really fine-tune your panel placement and make sure that all of your early reflections are well treated. Here I've got another example of speaker boundary interference response or reflections occurring in a room. So this is that same room, but now I reconfigured the treatment and the panels in there a little bit. Our first measurement, the blue one here, has 2 panels right in the middle of the back wall in the room. And then our second measurement here has those 2 panels removed and placed on the floor in between the speaker and the microphone. So we can see some pretty interesting things happening here. Our first measurement very clearly has a spike in energy right around 4 milliseconds, very quick after our initial sound source. And then our second measurement, the measurement that doesn't have the panels on the back wall anymore, has a big reflection, or has 2 big reflections at 15 milliseconds and 16 milliseconds. So we can pretty easily take away a couple of things here. One, our floor reflection is obviously happening at 4.3 milliseconds because as soon as we put 2 panels on the floor, we were able to get rid of that. And then in doing so, we had to take those 2 panels that were in the middle of the back wall and put them on the floor. And then we created this big reflection at 15 and 16 milliseconds. So now we know where in time our reflection off the back wall is occurring and where in time our reflection off the floor is occurring. For reference, this room's 14 feet deep and our measurement microphone was 5 foot 5 inches away from the front wall. So that means our reflected sound would have to travel past that microphone, hit the back wall, and then bounce back. And if our mic was 5 foot 5 inches away from the front wall, it was just over 8 feet away from the back wall, which means we would expect to see that reflected sound occur right around 16 milliseconds or a little bit over 16 milliseconds, which is exactly what we're seeing here. So that's how you can figure out using your energy time curve or your impulse responses which boundary or surface in your room your reflected sound is coming off of. So we've got another set of measurements for us to analyze here, and these were taken in a room that was really well treated. So our first measurement shows that room fully treated, and then the second measurement that we're going to look at shows the same room but with the cloud removed. And I'll flash a picture up on the screen here so you can see what that room actually looked like with all the acoustic treatment in it. So I have our waterfall plot pulled up here, and this is the room with the cloud as well as the rest of the treatment. You can see a really nice even decay across the frequency spectrum and a pretty even overall frequency response with only 1/48 smoothing on this. If I switch over to our second measurement without the cloud, we're going to start to see a really massive change here. Starting around 300 hertz or so, we can see all of these echoes occurring and a much longer decay across the frequency spectrum. So this is just from that sound bouncing back and forth between the floor and the ceiling in that room. As that cloud was removed and the rest of the room was really well treated, there was a really prominent flutter echo that was created because we had a very well treated room and then 2 very reflective parallel surfaces that were left. And we can clearly see that here in the waterfall plot. Let me switch back over to the untreated room again. So you can see this gets really well cleaned up. And then if we flip back over, we've got the flutter echo that's very clearly seen here, as well as this increased decay time down here. And I'll leave the cursor here and switch back over so you can see that again. Clearly a very large change in both the decay time of the room and cleaning up that flutter echo. And that's just the difference that one cloud can make. To give you a more complete sense of what these measurements look like with and without that cloud, let's take a look at the ETC, the RT60, and our frequency response. So right off the bat, we can see a big change in the overall frequency response. We've got this big null that was created around 120 hertz, and then we've got 2 peaks above that we also see introduced to the frequency response. I'm going to remove the measurement that doesn't have the cloud in it and smooth this measurement to 1/3 so we can take a look and see what kind of variation we have in the frequency response of this measurement. As I mentioned earlier, the standard for the best studios in the world, or EBU critical listening environments, is plus or minus 2 dB with 1/3 smoothing. And then really great home studios fall typically between plus or minus 5 dB. And that's all with 1/3 smoothing on. Let's take a look and see how this room is performing. So I'm going to right click on our peak here while hitting Control and then scroll down to the lowest point in our measurement, and we can see that we've got a variation here that's about 6 or 7 dB, so plus or minus 3, plus or minus 3.5 dB. So like I said, achieving a really great home studio is pretty attainable. There was around $4,000 worth of acoustic treatment in this room, but it's just a regular bedroom. It's 14 by 11 feet with an 8-foot ceiling, so you can definitely turn that extra room in your house or your bedroom or whatever it may be into a really great sounding room. All right, so here we've got the energy time curve pulled up for this measurement, and the difference between these two is pretty wild and striking. Like some of the other graphs with and without treatment that we've looked at before, this green measurement without the cloud very clearly shows where these reflections are occurring. Like we saw that reflection off the floor, this reflection off the ceiling now is right around 4 milliseconds. And if you have an 8-foot ceiling and your measurement mic is at 4 feet, you would expect those to be pretty much at the same point in time. So that makes perfect sense. And then these later reflections here that we're seeing are going to be what we saw in the waterfall plot as that flutter echo, where it was pinging back and forth a lot. So if I highlight our red measurement here, we can see just how different these two are and really pinpoint where that new reflected energy is occurring over time in the room. Last thing I want to look at with these measurements is the reverb time. So I have our T20 pulled up here for this room with the cloud, and then I'm going to add in the same T20 measurement but without the cloud. So adding in that T20 without the cloud, we can start to see that our reverb time not only got more inconsistent, but also increased quite a bit. And like I said earlier, our main goal with reverb time is to have it be as even as possible so we don't have any big jumps from one band to another like we see here and then also here down below. Utilizing all the different measurements within REW, we can really start to get a complete picture of what is happening in the rooms and how we can improve the sound in those spaces, either by moving acoustic treatment or adding new treatments that are better suited to the needs of the room. While I mentioned that the SPL or frequency response measurement was not my favorite, it does particularly excel in one area. And that is taking a group of measurements and comparing them directly to one another so that we can see how the overall tonal balance of the room is changing. So here I have a measurement set pulled up with 7 different speaker placements that I tested, and we're going to take a look and see which one performed the best and how those vary from one location to another. So with all 7 of these measurements piled up on top of each other in the overlays, it's a little hard to tell what's going on. So let's clear them all out, and then we'll pull in our first measurement. Now these were all taken in an untreated room, so things are pretty all over the place, but it's a great way to see the room's overall response and how we can start to even things out just by moving our speaker and listening position locations. So here's our first measurement, and this turned out to actually be the best measurement in the set. It's got a response that's around plus or minus 9 dB. As we start to add in our other measurements, sometimes things were pretty close to this, and other times they were quite drastically worse. So with B, right off the bat, we can see a pretty big variation in just these first 2 measurements, and this was just moving the speaker a couple inches. The peak from our mode came down here a bit, but the nulls that we have up above that dropped way down. Adding in our C measurement, now we can see what that new speaker placement is adding, and again we've got basically the same changes from A to B. We've got the room mode peak coming down, but then we've got that null, so it's a little bit better than B, but still doesn't quite have the overall balance that we had with A. Now let's add in that D measurement. So here we've got a response that's much closer to what we had with our initial response, that A measurement. So things are definitely more balanced out than with B or C, but doesn't have any real improvements over A. So let me go ahead and hide C and B so that we're just looking at the 2 best measurements now. And we can see a little variation overall, but very similar shapes to these 2 measurements and nothing really too striking that makes one of these measurements significantly better than the other. So continuing on with our comparison, let's pull in E here, and we can see again, this jumps kind of back to that B and C. So slight change to the room mode response around 80 dB, but again, we've got this huge null now at 126 Hertz or so. And then if we add in F, we can actually see a very similar response, but even worse. So now this is off of our graph. So let me adjust my measurement here so we can get the whole picture. And if we go ahead and plot the variation of this, we've got a variation of over 30 dB or so. So that's plus or minus 15 dB. And if we compare that to A, we're at plus or minus 9. So just by improving our speaker placement and listening position locations, we evened out the response in this room by 6 dB, which is pretty incredible. So we finally made it. I know this was a long video, but I truly hope that it helps give you a better understanding of acoustic measurements, REW, and how you can use acoustic measurements to improve the sound in your studio. If you liked the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.